Probably Ilchong will welcome you again to this session in a couple of seconds, but first already welcome to the SDPI for SSE session today as part of the GSEF Global Virtual Forum. And today we are going to talk a bit about the SDPI project, which is a 4-year research project by UNRISD. So Ilchong, Yi will give a short introduction to that. Then Peter Utting, who's with us already, will discuss indicators and targets for transformative change, followed by a presentation by Margie Mendel on the limitations and opportunities of existing SSE indicators. And then Sonja Novkovic will talk about implications of selected SDPI indicators for SSEOEs, and all at the very end there will be a very short presentation on the next steps of the SDPI, especially the pilot testing. Welcome everyone who's joining the session right now, already sharing your thoughts and in the chat. Please keep doing so. We have several people of our project team at the session, so if you have questions, please either save them for the Q&A sessions that will happen after the presentation by Peter Utting, as well as after the presentation by Sonja Novkovic, as well at the very end there will be a longer discussion on the whole project and the various elements that have been presented and discussed at that point. Okay, Ilchong is just texting me that they have a power cut.
Power cut.
Yes.
Where is he?
He's in France.
He's in France.
Yes.
Okay.
So what we can do instead is we can maybe start off with the presentation by Peter and jump back to the introduction of the SDPI project if all of you or if none of you have a problem with that. And Peter, would you also be okay going ahead with your presentation already?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let me, so I switch to shared screen.
Yes, I will quickly stop sharing and then you can go ahead. And please excuse everyone, this was really unpredicted, that exactly 5:30 Geneva time, the power would cut in Ilchong's home, but sometimes this just happens. So I hope it will not be a problem to follow the general ideas of the presentation. Peter, how's it going?
Okay, shared screen. Very good.
Yeah, maybe go back to the first slide.
Okay, are we good? Everyone's connected and except Ilchong? Well, greetings from Nicaragua. I had warned Ilchong and Sam that the power outage was likely to occur here in Nicaragua, not in France. So for the time being in Nicaragua, we're still good. So I'll be talking about, the title is Indicators and Targets for Transformative Change, it's about measurement, disclosure, and reporting related to the social performance of organizations. Now, this work emerges from really over 20 years or more than 20 years of work we were doing at UNRISD on both corporate social responsibility and social and solidarity economy. But my particular part in this whole project has been related pretty much to the for-profit sector. So I'm sort of the odd person out on this panel and probably the odd person out in the entire conference, because I'll be focusing more on the for-profit sector and particularly large corporations, transnational corporations. But later on in the presentation, I'll bring out sort of what I think are the implications for SSE that emerge from the research I've been doing with Kelly O'Neill on measurement, disclosure, and reporting related to sustainability performance of corporations. Now, the initial concern was that so much has been done over 30 years in developing standards for companies to report on how they're doing in relation to social and sustainable development. But reading those reports one is left none the wiser as to how really an organization is doing in relation to sustainable development, and what we call in this project transformative change. Now, the term transformative change is being used by just about everyone, not least in the aftermath, in the follow-up to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which talked about the transformational vision of the 2030 agenda. But often when people use the term transformative, it's not really clear what the real meaning is. So we've defined it quite specifically in terms of change that addresses the structural dimensions that reproduce unsustainable development. And not only structural change, but it's also change that in a sense is a journey towards thresholds and benchmarks, if you want an end goal that characterizes conditions which we associate with sustainable development. So as I said, my focus is on the for-profit sector, but I'll bring out some of the implications later for SSE. Now, there's a lot of concern out there about what's happened with sustainability reporting, and there are a lot of innovations and reforms underway to try and improve it. Now, two of the major issues which have been focused on are the issues of the reporting burden, the overload that, on what organizations are expected to report on, and the lack of standardization or harmonization. So these were aspects that have been particularly taken up by UNCTAD, and we've sort of piggybacked on the work of UNCTAD, and later Sam or Il Chong, I think, will explain how that work on standardization has been factored into our project. But what I did in my work with Kelly O'Neill was to pay far more attention to two issues which we think have been highly limited. One is what we call blind spots, i.e. the key issues within reporting that are still being ignored. The second is that data is often presented out of context. If you like, we can't see the forest for the trees. Often we're told a bit about how nice a few branches are and how the leaves are doing well, but it's very difficult to see what the bigger picture related to sustainable development is. And then another concern we had is that when assessing how organizations are progressing in terms of sustainable development, the tendency is to assess things incrementally, i.e. look at change from one year to another, not in relation to what we call a normative sustainability goal, or the sustainability norm. So these are things I'll be talking about in my presentation. Now, when it comes to the blind spots, so it seems to us that the certain issues that are fundamental from the perspective of sustainable development, certain issues are often ignored, and they're fundamental because, as I said before, they relate to the structural conditions that reproduce social and economic injustice. So we focused in particular on aspects of inequality, aspects of what we can call distributive justice in related to income and wealth distribution, and particularly the problem of skewed power relations. Power relations is a fundamental blind spot, we believe, within sustainability reporting. So the research I did with Kelly on the SDPI project focused in particular on 5 areas: on fair remuneration, where we looked at both income inequality within the corporation and the question of the payment of a living wage. Another was gender equality within the workplace, where we focus on pay and issues of promotion, but also support for caregiving. And I'll go into this in some detail later on. The third was corporate taxation. And then, so those first 3 are related particularly to issues of distributive justice. And then 4 and 5 are related more to the question of power relations. 1 focusing on labor rights of collective bargaining and freedom of association. And the final one on corporate political influence. How do corporations exert influence on public policy, on the political sphere, etc. So the sorts of concerns we have related to these structural issues, you'll see in the lower left, this is the share of tax havens that are accounted for in corporate profits in the US. So how profit shifting to tax havens has increased dramatically in this particular graph from the 1980s to the present day. The second, on the right, we have issues to do with income inequality within corporations. This is measured by the CEO, the chief executive officer to worker compensation remuneration pay ratio, which has escalated sharply, again, particularly since the 1980s, 1990s. Another on related blind spots related to power relations. On the left, we had the decline in union membership rates in the United States, which depicted on the red line, which correlates with the decline in the middle class share of aggregate income. And then on the right, we have these referring to the trends in corporate political spending versus labor spending. So corporate political action committee spending is going up, but labor PACs are going down. So when it comes to assessing progress, as I said before, we have to assess progress in relation to an end goal that we believe reflects conditions associated with sustainable development. So what tends to happen now is that the bar for assessing progress is set very low. So very often the tendency is to report how wages within a corporation are doing in relation to the minimum wage, not in relation to the living wage. We see companies disclosing information on the CEO employee pay ratio, but no efforts to actually reduce it. We see commonly accepted the fact that there should be equal pay for people doing similar work or equal work, but they don't measure the gender pay gap, what's called the unadjusted gender pay gap, which is the average remuneration of women as the percentage of that of men. Maternity leave tends to be the focus of attention, not support for caregiving throughout the life cycle. So the constraints on women participating in the labor force don't just have to do with pre and postnatal care or adoption. They have to do with care responsibilities they have throughout the teenage years or preteen years, for elderly people, for disabilities, etc. On taxes paid, companies tend to report the amount they paid, which can sound quite impressive, several million here or there. They don't measure the tax gap, i.e. the difference between the effective rate they're paying and the statutory rate, or they don't provide information on profit shifting to tax havens. On working conditions, the tendency is to focus very much on occupational health and safety, not on labor rights. And in corporate political spending, data is increasingly provided when it comes to political campaign contributions, but not spending on lobbying. So in the SDI project, we've insisted a lot on the importance of presenting data in context. At the moment, we say data tends to be decontextualized. So I'll spend a bit of time on this because it's important to understand this concept. And I'll give some examples. So if we compare, so in these examples, I'll be comparing, say, conventional disclosure with what we call sustainability disclosure. That is in context. So conventional disclosure, we're likely to see that a company reduced its carbon emissions per unit of revenue or per unit of output by 5%, say between 2015, 2020. What we're interested in if we're applying sustainability norms and contextualized data is to see that also the information that probably isn't there. The company reduced its level of emissions. It may have reduced its levels of emissions intensity, but its absolute levels of emissions increased by 10%, because its growth in manufacturing output was 20%. So absolute emissions, which is what ultimately is important for preventing global warming, continue to increase, but they provide data on relative emissions intensity, which decreases. So by failing to look at the absolute picture, we don't see what the real picture is as regards emissions. Also, company may have good data related to resource intensity, but it has failed to align with the science-based climate change mitigation targets. In relation to fair remuneration, in conventional disclosure, we may be told that the company met its target of ensuring that all entry-level employees have earn above the minimum wage. Obviously, this is positive, but while the company achieved its fair remuneration target of meeting the minimum wage, average workers' wages were still 30% below the living wage. The CEO worker pay gap had increased from 100 to 1 to 300 to 1 over the last 10 years. And the unadjusted gender pay gap, which I explained before, was still over 20%. So these are the things we think that sustainability reporting needs to assess. On gender equality, under conventional disclosure, the company met its target of equal pay for equal work. The same company also achieved 50% representation of women. Sounds good. Under sustainability disclosure, what we want to know is that because men occupy higher management positions and women are concentrated in lower positions, the unadjusted gender pay gap was 20%. And women only accounted for 10% of senior management positions. In relation to labor rights, the company reports that 70% of it provides a company-wide figure, average. 70% of employees were covered by collective bargaining agreements. Sounds good. Now, while significant, over 5 years, and this is what we would want to see from sustainability disclosure, over 5 years, this had declined from 85 to 70%. Furthermore, the data only relates to full-time employees, but during this period, the company reduced the proportion of full-time employees, relied more on subcontracted or part-time labor that are denied basic labor rights. And additionally, the company-wide figure of 70% masks wide variations in the coverage by affiliate or in different regions where the company operates. So these are things we'd want to know. Taxation, as I said before, the company pays millions in taxes, but it also engages in tax avoidance strategy where 50% of profits are recorded in tax havens. And finally, on the question of political spending, corporate political influence, the company is transparent in disclosing that it contributed $1 million to political campaigns, but the transparency was highly limited because it failed to disclose that another $1 million were channeled through third-party lobbying organizations such as trade associations, and that the causes it lobbied for, which were basically had to do with environmental, fiscal, and labor market regulation, contradict basically what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are trying to achieve. So this issue of context is important, and it leads us to highlight the need for 4 different points of emphasis in sustainability reporting. One is we can't just get an annual snapshot of what's happening. What happened from this year to the next? That tells us absolutely virtually nothing. What we need is time series data and trend analysis. So it's much more when looking at how collective bargaining rates have changed. If it moved from 69% to 68% last year, that doesn't tell us much. What we want to see is the trend over, say, 5 or 10 years. That is much more meaningful. So we need time series data and not the annual snapshots. We need far more what's called granular disclosure to detect variations in performance. We don't just need a company-wide average, because that often hides areas where performance is extremely poor. So we may have 50% women's representation in a company, but what we also want to know is that women's representation in senior management is only 5 or 10%, and it tends to be concentrated mainly in the lower occupational categories. The third thing is we want to be able to identify contradictions. So focusing narrowly on one indicator often diverts our attention from other areas of negative performance. So improved labor rights for full-time employees may be happening, but in the context of increased reliance on subcontracted labor, which don't have any labor rights. And the fourth aspect is what I referred to before as the sustainability norms or targets. The question is, how can we assess progress in relation to sustainable development if we don't have a benchmark or an end goal to aim for that is consistent with the concept of sustainable development? So the question is, what is the boundary or threshold? What's that end goal that indicates a condition that's consistent with sustainable development? Now, in the environment field, we see some progress happening in setting such benchmarks. So we see increasingly calls for carbon emissions reduction to be consistent with with keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. So we see a number of interesting things happening in relation to environmental reporting, but setting thresholds related to social and the governance dimensions of sustainable development, we think lagging well behind. So let's look at some examples of sustainability norms. So if we take the living wage rather than the minimum wage. So the living wage is the wage that covers the basic needs of what's called a standard or a typical family, and including a bit for discretionary spending and sometimes a bit for savings. So this data from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance contrasts in different countries the minimum wage. So in the case of China, this is quite some years ago, but the idea is the same. In China, the minimum wage in the red, in this one here, was 174, equivalent to 174 euros, and the living wage was 376. So we can see that difference. This is work by the Wage Indicator Foundation, and this is comparing the minimum wage, the living wage, and the actual wages of let me see if I get this. So minimum wage in the gold column, living wage for families, for standard typical families in the light blue, and these are the actual wages of low-skilled, medium-skilled, and high-skilled workers. So this is contrasting wages in Mexico and Germany. What's important here isn't the difference between Mexico and Germany. Obviously, there are going to be huge wage differences. What is important is the relationship between these levels. So what we see in the case of Mexico is that the low-skilled worker here in number 5 is earning just fractionally above the minimum wage in the gold. But both the minimum wage and what the low-skilled worker are earning are well below the living wage for a family. If we contrast that with Germany, we see that roughly the minimum wage, the living wage for families, and the wages of low-skilled workers are more or less the same, with low-skilled workers actually earning slightly above the living wage. And obviously, medium-skilled and high-skilled workers earning way above the living wage. So it's that relationship which is important, and the same can be done for any organization. In relation to gender inequality within the workplace, so what we've been looking at is disadvantage within the career structure, where you have to look at gender balance by different occupational categories at entry level, junior management, senior management, the chief executive officers, etc. Here, the norm, we set the norm, sustainability norm at parity throughout the different occupational categories, not just for the company as a whole. The in relation to disadvantage in pay, the gender pay gap, again, the norm would be parity, equal no zero pay gap. And in relation to disadvantage in the workplace that relates to the care burden, which is depicted in the cartoon by Carlos Tovar, that as it's so difficult for women to advance within career structures because of all the other hurdles and responsibilities they have, not least related to caregiving. Here, rather than a sort of quantified, viable norm, we would have qualitative disclosure related to how, ideally public policy, but also how corporations are providing multiple forms of support for women and caregiving responsibilities throughout the life cycle. And of course, not just for women, for parents, men and women. So question arises, how are sustainability norms established? Because this is a very new area. There's very little work's been done on this. Some very interesting work by some of our colleagues within the project, not least Mark McElroy and Reporting 3.0, which is now R 3.0. But what we propose is that there be set up a group led by UN agencies to really look into this whole question of context-based reporting and setting sustainability norms. But the problem is this, obviously my views or anyone's views on what's fair or sustainable may be very different from another's, okay? So there needs to be some level of consensus. Now, in some cases, we already see that consensus exists. So the idea of equal pay for equal work is very widely accepted. Zero bribery is a very widely accepted norm. Some norms are emerging or recent. So science-based targets to reduce carbon emissions to prevent global warming above 1.52 degrees centigrade is a recent norm that's been set. Some are emerging, so there's increasing talk now about the living wage, and companies are paying a bit more attention to reporting on the living wage. Much more attention now to gender representation targets, particularly in senior management and the boardroom. Some norms are pending, so we're seeing now the issue of inequality, extreme income inequality within corporations, as measured by the CEO employee or CEO worker pay ratio. That is now coming onto the agenda. But what's not looked at is how to reduce, what would a fair CEO worker pay ratio look like? What should we be aiming for? So in the absence of well-established norms, what we did in the research was start to take a number of reference points. So, and there were several, this we did not on a hugely systematic basis, but I think more as an approach to show that this is the sort of work that needs to be done by sort of the type of entity we recommended. So one is to look at the recognized best practices among companies or organizations. These are often being highlighted, we can see what they are, and some of them refer to sustainability norms. Other approaches to look at models of capitalism, say the Nordic countries, or models of enterprise, like co-ops or SSE organizations, which are generally considered fairer. So what would the pay ratios, for example, be within those sorts of organizations? We can look at recent periods in history that were considered fairer, like the 60s or 70s when it comes to income distribution or labor rights. We can look at benchmarks or standards set by rating organizations to rank or rate companies in terms of good sustainability performance. Some of those refer to sustainability norms. And we can look at public policy or public policy proposals that also include norms in regulations, etc. So just to wind up now, and so really with this project, just to recap, what we did was to try and emphasize the importance of what we call transformative indicators to measure performance related to structural dimensions of sustainable development. notably in relation to the fair distribution of resources. So we have fair distribution within the organization, which, for example, the pay ratio between high and low paid employees. We have the gender pay gap, we have the payment over living wage. We have fair distribution, if you will, vis-a-vis society, say through corporate taxation. Is the amount corporations are paying in tax fair from a societal point of view? And we have the question of equitable social and power relations, including responsibility for caregiving, which impacts gender equality in the workplace, workers' empowerment through labor rights, and corporate political influence. So I think in looking at the big picture here, the implications for SSE are this. If structural aspects linked to economic growth and accumulation, linked to the concentration of market power, linked to forms of domination and hierarchy, if these things heavily condition the possibility of progress towards sustainable development, then a key objective or challenge related to SSE is to demonstrate how alternative forms of economic organization facilitate progress through very different modes of organization, exchange, and democratic governance. And these will involve alternative forms of income and asset distribution, gender, and power relations. Now, it seems that it is these attributes of SSE that are often ignored when SSE organizations are called upon to report on their performance. And these are issues which Margie and Sonia will be taking up. So thank you very much. A lot of this this work is now being published, the research I've been doing with Kelly O'Neill, in a large report called Accounting for Sustainability, What Can or Shouldn't Corporations Be Doing? The overview, extended overview, about 30 pages, has already been published and it is available on that link. And the full report is due out in 2020. And there have also been, I think, about 4 policy briefs on different issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and my apologies to all the participants because there was a power cut when I was about to start my opening remarks. So I'm Il Chang-yi, Senior Research Coordinator at UNRISD. Would have been moderated at the beginning of this session, but now I'm back. I will moderate this session from now. And initially, I wanted to talk about something about our institute because there must be people who are not very much familiar with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD. So I will put my, how can I share? I'll share screen and yeah, share. Okay. Can you see my screen now? No?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So
please go to presentation mode before, however.
Okay, so okay, so let Sam, could you share yours?
Of course.
If possible.
Give me 1 second, please.
Yeah. Is it working now? No?
Yes. Everybody should now see your slides.
Okay. So I cannot see myself though. Okay, so I can see that. Okay. As I said, for those who are not familiar with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD, I'd like to explain about our institute first. Next slide, please. The United Nations Research Institute for Social Development was established in 1963 as an autonomous research institute within the UN system that undertakes interdisciplinary research and policy analysis on the social dimension of contemporary development issues. Since 1963, it has conducted researches on various issues relevant to social development that are pertinent to the work of the United Nations Secretariat, regional commissions, specialized agencies, national institutions, and non-governmental organizations. Next slide, please. As Peter explained, today's session is about how to measure progress towards the SDGs. I think many of you working on social and solidarity economy at least once must have raised the kind of question like, is that SSE organization or enterprise really doing well? Or how good is that SSE organization in terms of its contribution to sustainable development? That is the kind of question to trigger all the efforts for measurement of the performance of any organization. UNRISD research team on Sustainable Development Performance Indicators, or SDPI project, also started with this simple question. Next slide, please. The objectives of the project, this SDPI project, was first to assess the adequacy of existing methods and systems for measuring the contribution of enterprises to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, we aim to expand the scope of sustainability measurement, disclosure, and reporting beyond for-profit enterprises to encompass enterprises and organizations that make up the social and solidarity economy. Thirdly, we aim to identify data points and indicators related to SSE that may inform conventional approaches to sustainability measurement associated with for-profit enterprises as well. And finally, we aim to identify and test a set of sustainable development performance indicators that can address the 21st century challenges which Peter touched upon in his presentation. UNRISD SSE and external experts and collaborators like we have today, Peter, Margie, Sonia, started reviewing the existing principles, methods, and indicators to measure the impacts and values created by economic entities for both SSE organizations and enterprises and for-profit enterprises. And we have examined them to identify potentials and limits. That journey started in 2018 with the founding, with the kind of a project funding from Korean think tank, Center for Social Value Enhancement Studies, which was founded by the SK Group. And it has been a long journey full of tough but exciting challenges. And now we have our own methodologies and indicators, which we think can address those limits and maximize the potential of the existing methodologies and indicators. Today, our presenters, we have already had Peter's presentation, but our presenters who are external collaborators and expert group members for the project will explain what we found during our journey and what we want to suggest as methodology and indicators which can help SSE organization and enterprise to measure their own performance. We already had a kind of a good taste of Peter's methodology and indicator explanations. So next slide, please. Before we go into the discussion on findings and lessons and indicators from the project, I think it would be helpful for you to know some historical backgrounds of UNRISD research which are relevant to this project. Could you click the PowerPoint again? So the first I cannot see my PowerPoint anyway, so I mean, no, the previous one, please. Okay, so first is the project contents and measurement of socioeconomic development conducted from the late 1960s to the early 1970s. In those days, mainstream methodology and indicators to measure development were those related to national income, such as national income per capita, GNP per capita, or GDP per capita. This project, was questioning the validity of these indicators for the analysis and measurement of socio-economic development as a whole. After intensive research involving data collection for 115 countries, UNRISD identified 73 developmental indicators and reduced them to 18 core indicators whose information could show interrelationship between social and economic development. This research tradition, in particular, questioning the adequacy of the existing indicators for measuring development, still remains in UNRISD, and it has evolved with the other two research traditions, namely corporate social responsibility from a development perspective in the 2000s and social and solidarity economy in the 2010s. I think here, I mean, we have the best person who can talk about these two research traditions. It is Peter Wooting, who just presented his issues about methodologies and indicators, because he was UNRISD deputy director and in charge of these two research projects. So, Peter, could you explain about how UNRISD started paying attention to these two research projects, like a CSR and SSE, and what were the findings and lessons relevant to our SDPI project? Could you come in, Peter? You have to unmute your microphone.
Hello? Yeah. So I think the common denominator for both the projects, in a sense, was the Earth Summit. So the corporate social responsibility program emerged around so the Earth Summit was in 1992. Right? Now, at that time at UNRISD, we were doing a lot of work on environmental responsibility related to NGOs, related to communities, related to government states. And then the Earth Summit came along, where one of the big issues was corporate environmental responsibility. So we attended that, and out of that, we realized, well, this should be an important area of UNRISD work. We've done the civil society, the communities, the state responsibility. So we started to look at corporate environmental responsibility in relation to the private sector, transnational corporations in particular. Now, there was a lot of concern at that time that the new buzzwords, the new discourse on corporate social responsibility was, the word they used was greenwash back then. Misinformation provided by corporations to give the image that they were doing great things on the environmental front. So there was a lot of concern about it. There was a lot of concern about what was called corporate self-regulation. So transnational corporations were all starting to develop their own codes of conduct. So what we did was to take a sort of a good hard look at, again, sort of the potential and limits of corporate social responsibility, and under what conditions, political, institutional, economic, etc., under what conditions might corporations actually take this seriously. Now, this coincided, so a year or two later, this coincided with the rise of what they call multi-stakeholder standard setting initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives. And So in 1993, we had the formation of the World Forest Stewardship, the Forest Stewardship Council. We had the Marine Stewardship Council, came along a bit later. In 95, I think it was, we had the ISO 14001 standards for environmental disclosure. In 97, the Global Reporting Initiative was formed. And so what we started to do is take a look at how effective were all these new standard setting initiatives, and again, under what conditions could they work? So, and then what happened in 20 years later, we had Rio Plus 20, the 20-year follow-up to the Earth Summit. And again, I attended that, and by that time I developed, basically because of my own long time I'd spent in Nicaragua, or I still am, I developed a close interest in social solidarity economy and cooperatives, but hadn't actually worked on that whilst at UNRISD. So I was always interested in the topic. And at the Rio Plus 20, there were multiple forums happening there. So there was the official venue, Intergovernmental Summit. There was the People's Forum, the vast, huge civil society meeting. When I attended there, it was obvious that SSE was being mentioned a lot at the People's Forum. There was a scientific conference, the Innovation Technology. It was also being mentioned there. And in a number of the side events organized at the official venue, there were one in particular organized by the Rencontre Mont Blanc. The main topic was SSE. Where SSE wasn't discussed was in the official intergovernmental summit, or in the document, the outcome document that came out of that. Co-ops get a mention. I think SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprise, get a mention, but SSE didn't. So talking with a few other UN colleagues there, I said, well, we should see how we can raise the profile of SSE within the mainstream UN system. So when I went back to Geneva, we said about trying to do this. The problem is how you do that in a small institute like UNRISD, which has no money. So what you end up doing is launching a global call for papers, which doesn't cost any money. And the response was overwhelming, as we got about 500 very detailed proposals in. And out of that, we organized the first major conference, UN conference, which we co-hosted with the ILO and UN NGLS in May of 2013. And then out of that came the idea of setting up the United Nations Task Force on Social and Solidarity Economy. So and the topic at that time was really the potential and the limits of SSE, and out of that emerged the book I edited on called Beyond the Fringe, Social and Solidarity Economy Beyond the Fringe, which looked at the whole issue of scaling up SSE in multiple dimensions. So that's sort of the origins of those two projects.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, those three elements, especially those two elements, Peter were in charge of in terms of research coordinator, research coordination, like a CSR and SSE, became the basis of this project on SDPI, Sustainable Development Performance Indicator. So now you have a background of this project and this project's methodology and some indicators. We are going to have a brief Q&A before we have a 10 minutes break. I mean, after 10 minutes break, we're going to have presentations by Margie Mendel and Sonia Novkovic. And finally, we're going to have presentation on pilot testing by Samuel Brueli-Sauer. But before we have a break, we can have a kind of very brief Q&A in which you can raise questions and comments on the presentation of Peter and me. If you have any questions, please look for raise hand button in your Zoom, and you just click the button and I will notify that you raised the hand and I will give you the floor. There is one comment from Layman Sana, and Layman Sana, would you like to make comment?
Hi, Chung. Hi to everybody. Now, it was just basically saying what Peter was summarizing. I think it's eye-opening and very important for everybody working on the SSE to see this in the historical perspective. So I would very much appreciate to see this again, to read it again. And I just heard from Sam, this will be, I think, recorded and maybe put on a piece of paper.
Thank you very much.
That was my comment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we have one question from Natalia Lara. Natalia, would you like to intervene? Okay. So Natalia's question is how can he how can he include transformative indicators in the budget line of countries gross domestic product? I cannot clearly get the meaning of this question, but I think it would be good for Natalia to explain a little bit about her question later. And we have, all right, Natalia.
Sorry, my internet is going wrong.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Natalia. I'm from Mexico.
Yeah.
And I was only asking, like, if there like a standard for how governments need to invest to the GDP, so or to the these indicators of transformation, if they're like a suggestion for government, so they could start having these indicators to be like more in an operative way. I don't know if I'm clear with my
Yeah.
explanation. Sorry, my English is not so good.
No, it's okay. I think Peter got the question right. And we have a question from Yvonne. Yvonne?
Yes, I wrote it down. Did you analyze the Global Reporting Initiative that was set up some years ago?
Yeah, I think it will be explained, but we did a thorough review of GRI, and we found that they suggested methodology of context-based sustainability, but they did not develop context-based indicators. So that is one of the kind of improvement and contribution of this project to existing indicators. Okay. So if there's no further question, maybe I can go back to Peter.
You're mute.
You have to unmute your microphone, Peter.
Sorry, in relation to Raymond Sana's question, and hello Raymond, hope you're well. Yes, there was an article I wrote and published in 2014 related specifically to the history of the UN task force. So, and that was published in the 2014 reader of the ILO's SSE Academy, which is on their Collective Brain website. And it's also available on the task force, UN task force website under publication. So it's called Raising the Visibility of SSE in the UN System. But if I remember rightly, it doesn't go into great detail about the origin of the CSR work. To Natalia, the only thing I can say that I think relates to your question is what we're seeing now in a number of countries. The UK and the US are quite prominent examples where governments have introduced regulation or laws which oblige companies to report certain things. So in the US now, all corporations over a certain size, publicly traded corporations, have to report on their CEO employee wage gap, remuneration gap. And in the UK and several other countries, but I think in the UK it seems to be more developed, they now have to report on the gender pay gap. So these relate to disclosure only. There's no suggestion of any norm or any target they have to reach. They just have to report what the gap is, and then it's up to others to comment, to critique, to criticize, etc., and to apply pressure on companies where these gaps seem excessive. But so we're starting to see now some regulation come into effect on this. Similarly, a lot of interesting public policy proposals, not yet public policy, but proposals. For example, Elizabeth Warren's had a proposal in her electoral platform that companies that are providing a certain amount in lobbying over a certain limit will incur a surcharge, a tax on that spending. Similarly, there's one initiative, public policy proposal in Quebec to think about a fair pay ratio in terms of a 30-to-1 norm. So this obviously contrasts greatly with what we're seeing in the US and other countries where it can reach well over 300-to-1 now. So those sorts of linkages, I think, with public policy and regulation are starting to emerge, but they're mainly for just disclosure only. And Yvonne, if you're referring to our past work on the Global Reporting Initiative, what we have there was a chapter, it was a book I edited called Business Regulation and Non-State Actors, Whose Standards and Whose Development, with Darrell Reed and Anya Mukherjee-Reed. And there was a chapter in there, very interesting chapter on the GRI by David Levy and Helena Brown.
Thank you very much. And we have another question from Valerie Vizier. Miss Vizier?
Hi, Valerie Vizier from FAO.
Yep.
I have a question. Related the difference between your set of indicator and the UNCTAD guidance on core indicator for entity reporting on the contribution towards the SDG. How the two sets complement each other, or are they aligning? Are they different? I just want to have more information.
I think that is very good question, because it is going to be explained after the break by Sonia. I can say that it is similar and different, but you will find the truth after the break. So we will have a break. Valerie, please stay with us, because you will get the answer after the break, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. So we will have a break for 10 minutes, and we will resume 6:40 in Geneva time. Please bring your cup of coffee in front of your computer and take a rest, and we will start 20 to 7 in Geneva time. Thank you very much. To the second part of tonight's session, and if it is a physical meeting, like a conference to gather all those people in one place, it must be the time to take a group photo. But we cannot do it, obviously, because of this online meeting. But we kind of had a very much innovative idea to take a group photo, which is a screenshot. So you turn on the camera, every one of you, and try to show your best side. Okay, we will take a group photo with screenshot, and Samuel is working on it. So please turn on your camera all together. So can you see us all in one place?
Almost.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
like
Yeah, we can see all.
Okay, so Xavier Gastelou, could you turn on your camera if you have? Layman, Erica, I cannot see you.
I'm
Okay,
here.
so
Lemon is coming.
okay, Layman is coming for group photo. Let's give a minute. Okay, Layman, are you ready? Try to show your best side. Erica Gonzalez. Hola, Erica. I cannot see you though. I can see Karam from Korea. I can see Tony from Cambodia. Okay,
Yes.
let's take a photo. Un, deux, trois. Smile. And you have to show your best side. Smile. Un, deux, trois. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
All right, I got plenty of pictures. Thank you all.
Thank you all. So we will go for next presentation by Maji Mendel on limitations and opportunities of existing SSE indicators. Maji, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And Sam, you will help me
Yes.
with my slides, please.
Oh, of course. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just for the excuse me, the title page, I want to draw your attention to the bottom. And the presentation is limitations and opportunities of existing SSE indicators. But this presentation is based on work that we did in 2018, and it's published on the UNRISD website. Sustainable Development Impact Indicators for Social and Solidarity Economy, State of the Art. The work was over 2018, 2019. It was published in 2019, and my co-authors are Gabrielle Salaté-Beaulieu and Marie Bouchard. Both Gabrielle and Marie are experts in the area of impact indicators. I am a fellow traveler that has embarked on this journey with my colleagues at UNRISD. And what I'd like to just mention is that much of what I'm about to present is based on that paper, so going back to the state of the art, but also about thinking that we have done collectively in the SDPI project and thinking that I have done. So next, please. If you may, what I'm about to introduce really bears no introduction in this crowd of almost 100 people, but I think it's important again to reiterate why it is that policymakers in particular and international organizations and increasingly the investment community and foundations and so on are so interested in SSE enterprises and organizations and how they associate these with the capacity for inclusive and sustainable development. I've listed several of the attributes of SSE enterprises and organizations. No doubt there are more, but if we just go through some of these: employment and wealth generation, the SSE is present in all goods producing sectors and and provides affordable quality social services, quality of employment, work-life balance, contribution to local sustainable development, democratic governance is at the heart of SSE. These are collectively owned enterprises and organizations, fair and equitable distribution, economic empowerment of women and minorities, work integration programs for marginalized men and women. And SSE increase is also an aspirational goal, and it has been all along. It has been an aspirational goal to live and work differently, and this is particularly relevant today for young people that are choosing the SSE to organize economic life. Then quite important is the role of collective action in economic and political empowerment, which contrasts very much with the assumptions that underlie the traditional or mainstream business model. So how do we evaluate the performance and the impact of social and solidarity economy organizations? This is an objective that they have themselves, but increasingly there is external pressure by third-party organizations, government, investors, foundations, rating agencies, and so on. Next, please. Sam, next. Okay, thank you. So what the inherent values, and Peter mentioned this, the inherent values of the, excuse me, Sam, how do I get rid of the pictures on the side so that because I'm missing part of the presentation, the text, is there a way to do that?
Yes, when there's on the, like above those pictures, there's 4 little symbols. If you click on the one that is all to the left of that little line, yeah,
Line.
it's just
Okay. Oh, perfect.
minimizing.
Thank you. Much as I liked seeing you, Peter, because your face was right in front of me. So the inherent values of SSE enterprises and organizations that I just went through, and to reiterate what Peter said, they set the bar for this project, for our SDPI project, based on years of collaborative international research, which identified the preceding core attributes that transform the lives of men and women and communities around the globe. And also the understanding, increasingly, the understanding that the social and solidarity economy is more than the aggregation of collective enterprises. It is contributing to systems change, to an alternative democratic vision of sustainable economic development embodying the UN SDGs, often referred to today as a regenerative economy, part of the regenerative economy. So the questions that we set out at the outset of the SDPI project was, do the values and objectives that are embedded in these organizations identify the transformative indicators that we wished to construct, that were to be applied across the board to private enterprise as well as to collectively owned enterprises. We had to, in so doing, identify existing enterprises indicators that are used by SSE organizations, and if these were effective in evaluating their transformative capacity. Next, please. So to continue on how we made the, how this project evolved, Peter and Kelly's work were very important in identifying the blind spots that have really, propelled this project to move forward in its design of transformative indicators. And in order to do that, we tried to compare whether these social and solidarity economy organizations addressed these blind spots. But just, I think what I'd like to do is underscore that we've got two tendencies, at least two tendencies going on at the moment. One is for self-evaluation of social economy enterprises that wish to be able to assess their performance, but because of the pressure, increasing pressure from outside funders, government, foundations, etc., there is pressure to impose homogeneity and uniformity on these organizations. And this is a problem, and I will come back to that later. The last point I would raise here is that how are SSE organizations involved in a design process of their own indicators? Next, please. So we are looking at the paper when we wrote it, and if we were to update it, we would again underscore the external pressure that is coming from the various funders and those who are interested in better understanding what social impact means. And increasingly, we feel that these are generating noise, and the tension between trying to find some form of comparability while also taking into account the specificities and diversity of the social economy. It exists in many sectors. It is working with many target populations. It is geographically distinct in different parts of the world. How are we able to reconcile the noise of so many indicators that are out there, the need for comparability, and yet the need also for specificity? If we look at the social and solidarity economy itself, and how it has evolved in recent times. In fact, the so-called new kids on the block, which are the nonprofit social enterprises or social economy enterprises, they are growing more rapidly in the current period than are the more traditional cooperatives. And this corresponds as well with the emergence of small and medium SSE organizations versus the history of the large and institutionalized cooperatives. Worker cooperatives are on the rise, especially in cases where there are more and more worker buyouts, emergent platform cooperatives. And we also have to take into account that the SSE includes of informal economy in many parts of the global south. And in some jurisdictions, the SSE also includes foundations and social enterprise. This is true in France, where they have framework legislation, and both are included. Next, please. If we add to this variegated landscape over the last few years, and it really is recent, we have a rapid growth of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social business, B Corps, community interest companies, community benefit companies. All of these merit discussion. Peter raised the issue of greenwashing. In his presentation, there has been issues raised of social washing. In the case of these hybrid enterprises that are emerging in both private and not-for-profit enterprises. The impact of investing market, which began in 2007, and the work of the Rockefeller Foundation resulted in a shift from social responsible investing and mostly filtering indirect investment to direct investment in enterprises, organizations, and networks. Also, we see the transforming role of foundations that are still primarily donors, but they are engaged increasingly as investors. Mission-related investment has increased and has widened. There are new impact investing portfolios in the major foundations. And so the need for evaluation and measurement tools is obvious. What is impact? How is this measured? Interestingly enough, they seem to have a handle on this because there is a new asset class for impact investing, and this is also helping investors identify this capacity to move beyond traditional investment. This really increased tremendously after the financial crisis, and a search for more ethical investing and what a moral economy is said by some. Next, please. Okay. So I'm going to actually go very rapidly through many slides here, and you'll forgive me because we have in our paper addressed many different forms of evaluation that have been used and that are continuously used by different SSE organizations and enterprises. But I just want to reiterate that this is not, or to put on the table that this is not a new issue. If we look at the history of microcredit or the just one example, the community development finance institutions in the US, or in Quebec, we developed a RISC, which is an investment fund dedicated exclusively to the social and solidarity economy. These were initiatives that were created in the 90s and had to have reporting mechanisms put in place. I'd like to underscore RISC in particular in Quebec because very early on, it was obvious and clear to those working in this area that built-in flexibility as well as overarching standards had to be applied in any form of evaluation or performance assessment. So this, and I see I have 1970s there, it's 1990s. So the need to report is not a new issue. Next one, please. So today, is it a burden or is it a challenge? As I mentioned earlier, I am not going to repeat that there is pressure, external pressure, and this is creating a lot of tension. It's putting a lot of stress on social and solidarity economy organizations and enterprises that struggle between this tension, the tension between comparability, uniformity versus customized or a la carte or bespoke indicators. And very often, and I've seen this in my own work because I work closely with different organizations, that these enterprises are forced to misrepresent or to divert or to compromise their complex goals in order to meet the criteria that are set externally, known in the foundation literature as mission drift. Also, very often, external evaluation experts have to be called in, and who bears the cost? These organizations, especially the smaller ones, do not have the resources to be able to carry these assessments out and have to pay for them as well. So the challenge is, how can enterprises and organizations in the social and solidarity economy mobilize and participate in the design of their own tools? Next, please. We've listed, I think we'll move right to the next one in the interest of time. Okay. So in our paper, and as I said here, I'm just going to race through this section. We have not an exhaustive list, but we have a fairly extensive selection of different performance methodologies, performance assessment tools, metrics, and indicators, some of which are listed here: the theory of change, social return on investment, social accounting, reporting, auditing, cooperative performance indicators, utilité sociale, which is evaluation of social utility, which is a French initiative, Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and I will explain how that has moved from a international development tool to actually being applied to some enterprises in the social and solidarity economy. Add to that the global impact investing networks, IRIS indicators and rating systems that are used by B Labs, and impact management project. Next, please. I refer to a few as moving beyond because they go beyond some of the examples that are in our paper, and I will, if we go to the next one, because we're going to come to each of these in detail. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, now I have, in addition to the PowerPoint, and if you don't want to read the 45-page article that we wrote, I do have notes on each of these.
You got 5 minutes.
Oh my God. Okay, so then you know what? Let's go very quickly. I'm not going to describe each of these. I'm going to go towards the end. Okay, so the first is logic model and theory of change. Next, please, Sam. Social accounting, reporting, and auditing. I'm going to focus on ones which we are using currently. Next one, please. SROI, social return on investment, has been used very widely. It has a problem, and that is that we have to monetize social impact, and that's a problem that occurs in almost all cases. Next, please. Cooperative performance indicators have indicators that correspond with the 7 main cooperative principles. Sonia will come back to these afterwards. Next, please. Evaluation of social utility. This is an initiative that was very interesting in France that has it takes stakeholder broad community impact into consideration. Next, please. Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which was used, as I said, in the field of international development. If you go to the next one, I'll show you how it was used in a particular illustration of the impact of microcredit on the livelihood of women in a context in Canada, not in Quebec this time. Next, please. IRIS metrics. There are hundreds of IRIS metrics, which now are IRIS Plus to be able to correspond with the SDGs. Next, please. B Impact has its scorecard, and you can see they've got average scorecards. company scorecards. In the case of Patagonia, it does extremely well. Next, please. Impact management project is not a measurement tool as such, but it's trying to bring actors together to be able to collaborate in achieving the goals that impact projects strive towards. Next, please. In 2014, and I want to underscore this, that there is a group at the European Commission that evaluated the various forms of, or the various initiatives in impact measurement and indicators. And we can just take that first quote: "One could not devise a rigid set of indicators in a top-down and one-size-fits-all fashion to measure social impact in all cases." I think this is what has to be our guiding principle in this work and in all the work that we're doing. Next, please. I won't, again, this is developed in the paper. We have a labor force committee in, in Quebec that addresses indicators and performance measures for the social and solidarity economy. 11,200 organizations and enterprises. They don't do this for all, but they work collaboratively in a co-design process of, flexible indicators with overarching standards. Next, please. Let's skip over since I have very little time. Next, please. Go ahead. Okay. The common approach. This is the work by our colleague Kate Ruff at Carleton University in Ottawa, who's really been grappling with this, again, this tension between overall, standards that all enterprises must adhere to, and the need for flexibility. Her work on construct-based equivalence and bounded flexibility is one I think that we identify with very closely. She has applied this to many social enterprise organizations because they are subjected to uniformity and homogeneity, and also subjected to a lot of noise because of the number of methodologies from which they have to select. Next, please. I would certainly urge everyone to look at the website of TIES, which is a knowledge transfer institute in Quebec. Gabrielle, who worked with us at UNRISD for a year and a half, is back at TIES and has put together a remarkable platform that really is all you ever wanted or didn't want to know about impact assessment. Next, please. I am a fan of Economy for Common Good matrix. I think these are iterations of tools that are advancing the conversation. And if you look at the different stakeholders and then the different general areas covered and how they are broken down, these are self-scoring. Hundreds of enterprises are using this in mostly in Europe. And I must say that, people tend to be very cynical because the scores are often imposed so as to social wash or to greenwash. But here companies often score themselves quite low. So I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to. Next, please. This is just a quick screenshot of the website that you should consult on TIES, which has all the information available on impact indicators. Next, please. Montreal Declaration, very briefly, this was in 2019. And I want to say that the Federation of Cooperatives was present. All the smaller and larger and medium-sized networks in the social and solidarity economy were present, and everyone agreed that there had to be a participatory mechanism in place that had to involve all stakeholders in any process of performance evaluation. Next, please. I have, and I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to introduce Lean Impact and UNEP for two reasons. I've highlighted at the bottom that Lean Impact is something which is relatively new. It's a methodology which is relatively new, but I think it raises a very, very critical issue, and that is on the need to build data science capabilities of SSE organizations. that combine new technologies with more traditional data gathering methodologies. This is really, I think, a priority that we have to take very seriously. Next, please. And both UNEP and Lean Impact, and I think there was a question raised before, link the micro and the macro. In many cases, the activities, the performance of social and solidarity economy enterprises is embedded in a public policy architecture. It cannot, when we are looking simply at the performance of these enterprises, we are unable to see what role enabling public policy is playing in their capacity to meet their objectives. I think that this is, again, a missing link. We cannot achieve SDGs in isolation. Somehow the absence of enabling public policy has to be addressed. And the measures they vary from legislation to fiscal measures to subsidies, public investment, procurement, customized policy measures, etc. I'm sure there are others, but I just highlighted here Lean Impact and UNEP, which do make those links, the links between the micro and the ecosystem. Next, please.
Margie, could you wrap up?
Yes, okay.
I think within 1 minute, please.
Okay, all right. So let me wrap up just with two punchy quotations. One by John Elkington, who was the the author of the triple line approach, and he says that the triple line approach to account for economic, environmental, and social impact was never intended as an accounting system. Its stated goal was system change, pushing towards the transformation of capitalism. Next, please. Let's go right to the end. Next, please. Keep going. I'd like to also quote Jed Emerson, because these are people who were the architects of impact investing, triple bottom line. And Emerson, in his new book, or latest book, The Purpose of Capital, says, maybe we should shut up and listen to the various and diverse human and non-human communities and history of experience. Maybe we need to create greater space to hear from those whose lives we seek to impact. I know that this is a hard, don't want to end on hard line, but we have a challenge, and that is that we do not wish in any way to impose upon social and solidarity economies and social and solidarity economy enterprises pressure to deviate from what they are doing well. And I think that, as you will hear from Sonia, the way in which we have designed and co-designed our indicators is a step in the right direction, or I certainly hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margie. As you can see, our research has been based on extensive and intensive literature review about existing indicators to identify potentials as well as limits. And now we are going to invite Sonia Novkovic, who will talk about the structure of SDPI indicators and the implications of those indicators for SSE organizations and enterprises based on this intensive and extensive review of existing indicators. Sonia, the floor is yours.
Yes, let me just make sure that everything is working as it should. You can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, after all of this, and thank you both, Peter and Margie, I may repeat some of the things that they've said, but for the most part, I'll try and bring to this the angle of the what is this SDPI, Sustainable Development Performance Indicator project? What are the indicators? What have we landed on? And look at the again the SSE informing the process and informing the indicators. This was the angle that most interested me in approaching this project. So the SSEs and sustainability measurement, Margie pointed out the pressures, external and internal pressures, but really the key question for social solidarity economy, and here we're talking about enterprises in the social and solidarity economy, obviously. So the question is really what to measure and why. Why, who needs to know, what is the purpose of measurement, And that is going to inform the process. So it may be very, very narrow, or it may be very broad, depending on why are you doing it, who needs to know, and what is it that they really need to know. And besides this, so the external pressures we've heard from Margie about, but mostly impact investment and small SSEs that actually depend on external funding, that are competing for resources, they are impacted by this, I would say, the most. But there is also more to it, the requirement to show to your constituents, to your members, in case of cooperatives and some others, that you actually, and making sure that you deliver on your mission and your purpose and your strategy, right? There is also the issue of isomorphism, and especially in large, mature cooperatives, this is the case, where they actually veer off. There's also mission drift, obviously, with mission-driven enterprises, but with co-ops, the isomorphism kind of creeps in through all kinds of professionalizations from the boards. As they grow, as they become big, they professionalize leadership, but they also professionalize management. And there is a lot that, these kinds of indicators that are gearing towards a different purpose, an economy with a different purpose, people-based, that they can use, sorts of indicators they can use to get back on track. And there is, of course, the need for transparency in democratic governance. So these indicators have to be transparent, available, and, as I said, measures that are clearly defined. Why are you doing it, right? That's the first question. And then if we talk about sustainability, the question is, and this project on sustainable development performance indicators, what is sustainability from social solidarity economy perspective? I mean, there is a broad definition of sustainability. We know that. So leaving the planet to the next generation, in a nutshell. But for social solidarity economy enterprises who really are about approaching the economy or creating a different kind of economy, an economy that's built on different principles and that serves a well-being of all. Then the question becomes, well, what is sustainable from the SSE perspective? And I believe that the SSE sector, or segment of the economy, does bring that different perspective. I'm sure most people here would agree. So what needs to be measured? Then the question is to demonstrate the unsustainable practices, both in and outside of this sector, but also those that are transforming the system and that are addressing the root causes of unsustainability. And Peter mentioned this effort in this project. So again, external pressures, we've heard about them, from stakeholder capitalism, the businesses declaring that now we're turning into stakeholder concern rather than shareholder concern, from the US Business Roundtable announcement to the Davos Manifesto. They're for-purpose enterprises, conscious capitalism, impact investment, and all sorts of new enterprises that are showing their social benefit side, as Margie pointed out in detail. The purpose of SSEs, really fundamental purpose of SSEs, has to be identified. And again, the measurements and assessments of how we're doing should have that point of view, is how I was approaching this project anyway. But I would imagine most of the team as well. So mitigating a social and economic injustice by means of collective action is at the core, at the heart of what SSE is about. And this socioeconomic injustice is creating unsustainable systems, right? So SSEs transform the economy by pursuing common good, by economic democracy, deploying economic democracy, and again, creating a civil economy. And that they're people-centered instead of capital-centered, recognizing, of course, that capital is a needed input, but it's not the purpose of the enterprise existence. So we are saying that SSEs are different, that they address structural issues, that they address regulatory blind spots, that they promote human dignity, and that they deploy ethical business practices. So then, if this is the case, and if SSE difference is not just in what enterprises are producing, so measuring outputs and outcomes of their activities, but also how they do it, the inputs, the processes, the why they do it, right? That matters in understanding this difference. How can we capture that in these measures and assessments of their performance, right? So it's about relations in production and consumption, and deploying other elements of relationships between people. I have been focusing in this project on cooperatives as the benchmark model, because not only do I do work in and with cooperatives, but it's also because they have well-defined values, they have well-defined principles, they have a statement on the cooperative identity that's enterprises catering to community needs, and a global network. And so this benchmark model is what I keep having in mind. Not that all SSEs are made equal, of course, but cooperatives inform the process. And this is what I was focusing on in thinking, okay, what is it that indicators from SSE perspective need to bring to the table? And I am getting to the specifics of the indicators, so just bear with me. So sustainability indicators ought to deliver on the following, in my mind. They need to expose structural causes of the unsustainable economic model that's dominating and the regulatory environment that's problematic. They need to expose unethical practices driven by the strive for profit, most often than not. They need to show the effect that these alternative business models have or aspire to have in various spheres of economic activity. They need to reveal the transformative potential, at least, of SSEs, if not ongoing transformation. And they need to nudge those who veered off the path to actually, as I already said, isomorphic pressures, get back on track with their purpose. This SSE difference is, again, in their purpose. And I said that already. So in addressing structural issues, well, let me actually point this out. Okay, so sustainability from SSE perspective is about the following spheres of influence. They make a difference in the distribution of power and income. And so these indicators, with Peter partially described already, are about looking at this distribution of power and income, the subordinate role for capital, the competitive pressure, they're mitigating market power in many cases. They are promoting human dignity, both impacting workers, communities, producers, consumers, so stakeholders engaged with the enterprise in a variety of ways. They're about decommodification and demarketization, if you will. So removing removing housing, food necessities from market pressures. About longevity to serve future generations, where enterprise is not a commodity, right, and not exposed to capital market speculations, but it's there to be used by this generation and the next generation of members. And growth by networks, they spawn, they spin off in ideal cases, although some grow by becoming bigger, which becomes a problem in many instances. All right, so here's then, with that in mind, that these indicators that we're looking at need to at least touch on some of these points of view of social solidarity economy. This is where we landed. So these are specific sustainable development, SDPIs, sustainable development performance indicators. So the point of departure and the requirement of the project was that they apply to all types of enterprises. And this is a little bit tricky because it maybe narrows the scope, but it definitely gives it a perspective that you have to keep in mind as you keep doing this. So it has to apply to all types of enterprises. And here's the answer to our participant who asked, what about UNCTAD core indicators? Well, that's our starting point. So UNCTAD indicators are included in SDPIs. So the 33 UNCTAD core indicators, I have a picture of the guidelines there. The UNCTAD core 33 are our starting point. But then we want to bring to it other measures that are going to address those blind spots Peter mentioned and put it in context that Il-Chung talked about. So this contextualization, be it trend over a number of years, or be it, well, there is a norm, we know what it should be, zero pollution, for example, that, putting it in context or adding a norm where that norm is accepted or known. And informed by the purpose of social solidarity economy, transforming economic relations, as I said already, right? So this being informed by SSEs, I think, is really quite important. All right, so here's then what SDPIs look like. So we start with Tier 1 core indicators of UNCTAD. They are divided into 4 sections. Those of you familiar with those indicators know that they have economic, environmental, social, and institutional indicators. From there, we keep economic, environmental, social, and institutional in the Tier 2, which is bringing context. So this is either, as I said, trends over a number of years, or it is relative to a specific norm. So keeping again the four brackets of the types of indicators. And then we have Tier 3, where we talk about transformative kinds of indicators. Some of the Tier 2 are also transformative, given that they do contextualize the indicators, but Tier 3 are added with specific SSE angle in mind, right? And again, economic, environmental, social, and institutional. Not surprisingly, it's the social sphere where SSE point of view was the most informative, in that we've expanded that segment or that section probably the most. So I have some examples. On the economic impact indicators, Tier 1, these are just some indicators that I've selected where I can actually show you the expansion. So on the economic in Tier 1, the measures are taxes and other payments to the government. There is the green investment, the amount of green investment, and all of these are defined in the guide notes there. Community investment by the enterprises, and R&D spending on research and development. And again, keep in mind, this is supposed to be filled by all types of enterprise. Tier 2 then is actually adding a measure of a 5-year tax gap. And the gap is statutory tax minus the effective tax that they pay. That creates the tax gap. And we look at the 5-year trend of that gap. There's also a 5-year trend in green investment. Is it going up or down? 5-year trend in community investment. And then there's the R&D spending, not all made equal. We want to know sustainability aligned research and development spending, right? So if it's sustainability aligned, then it goes into Tier 2. Tier 3 is adding an indicator on tax gap and fiscal disclosure, where there is a mandated external reporting of all the figures related to tax and tax havens. On the social indicators, or did I? Yeah, sorry, social, yes. Examples, Tier 1, % of women in management, employee wages and benefits, % of employees with collective agreements. We look at unionization. And this is in the UNCTAD 33 indicators. Tier 2 then expands it to, as I said, trends or norms, in this case, trends that I've picked, 5-year average gender diversity, entry-level hiring and promotion. So it's looking at entry-level as well, not just women in management. And 5-year union density and collective bargaining. So over 5 years, the trend again, it's going down or up. But then Tier 3 in the social indicators is looking at CEO to worker pay ratio. This is something that SSEs are absolutely mindful of, report on, cooperatives do for sure, and are keeping very low, right? So it's something that's clearly, the benchmark there would be quite different between the corporate sector and the SSEs. The living wage gap, so it's, the difference in pay versus living wage. Distribution of surplus is added. So how is profit distributed? We call it surplus for known reasons in this sector. Gender hiring and promotion at occupational level, and dependent care support. That's added for, again, reasons Peter described, which is that if you don't have dependent care support, women are less likely to be usually for the caregivers, which usually are women, would be less likely to be integrated into the workforce. The environmental indicators, again, some examples. Tier 1, the UNCTAD indicators, water recycling and reuse, reduction of waste generation, greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, so this is direct gas emissions. In Tier 2, we have a 5-year trend on solid waste reduction and greenhouse gas emission direct and indirect, so scope 2 is expanded. But in Tier 3 then, it's water use that is fair and within the boundaries, right? Within the boundaries of the watershed of the company in question. And greenhouse gas emissions, we go to scope 3, looking at your impact through the supply chain. And then we added also the indicators on the circular economy, participating in the circular economy. And on institutional, Tier 1 has indicators such as corporate governance disclosure by gender, by age, compensation of board members, and anti-corruption practices. In Tier 2, you will find those trends over 5 years and trends in corruption-related fines, right? So it's fines as well that need to be reported. In Tier 3, we're looking at corporate political influence, the blind spots that Peter was talking about, fines and settlements. So it's not just corruption-related fines, but also the settlements that didn't get into court. Board term limits, so democratic governance and some indicators within democratic governance, term limits, employee participation, co-determination, and resilience. In the resilience indicator, I have here multiple options because we are asking enterprises to self-report on what makes them more resilient. There are 5 or 6 options for resilience. So that's what the indicators look like. I think there's 85 of them. I'll refer back to Il-Chung and Sam to tell us a little bit more about what's next. But here, just to say that the implications of these indicators for SSEs, for social solidarity economy enterprises, mostly the transformative purpose and where they will find their niche is in the Tier 3. But social area is particularly fitting. We expect that social SSEs will do better in those areas than a comparative group. And it's also about mitigating isomorphism, as I think I already stated, but it's in the stakeholder focus, in sustainable practices, circular economy, democracy, and inclusion. And those measures hopefully will help SSEs measure up. Issues addressed in the environment, we address supply chain emissions, the circular economy, the watershed boundaries. In the social, we are addressing distribution of income, gender equity, labor rights, employment inclusion, and ethical sourcing. And I have a list of, the detailed list there, pay ratio, living wage gap, and so on. And the institutional, the context-based accounting, saying that accounting need to be put in context, otherwise it doesn't tell us much. Democratic governance, employee participation, information sharing, and resilience factors. Now, I just want to also mention that, of course, this is not the end of the story. More work is underway and needs to be done. For example, small SSEs may struggle with these indicators. They may struggle with reaching the living wage, for example. So many small SSEs actually are not able to pay a living wage, not because they wouldn't want to. So a trend would be indicative in those cases, but it may be quite frustrating for some small organizations who actually, are about inclusion. They're about reaching communities that are otherwise totally excluded, and they would be quite frustrated by some of the measures that we're saying are the norm. So trend and showing that you are actually paying attention to these issues is relevant. Context is absolutely relevant, and as I described, that kind of a context is absolutely important. We also, I think, need to look at the norms and revisit them and think, are they ambitious enough? Is this going to push us where we need to go fast enough? So that's another aspect of the indicators that may need to have another look. But there is the piloting stage, and this is where we're going to uncover some of these, hopefully, and see what works, what doesn't, tweak them. Again, Sam will speak to this. So it's about assessing the usefulness of these indicators, assessing their transformative potential, and seeing what issues organizations have in actually using them. And I also want to point out what you all, I'm sure, know, that measuring is not a panacea. That's not the end of the story. We need to have policies in place that actually support SSEs. So just the measurement, even so in the for-profit sector, measuring has its advantages, but are we going to see a push in the right direction? I don't know. We usually hear the saying that what gets measured gets managed, but there's also the what's most valuable cannot be measured. And many times it's about relationships and about, as I said, inclusion and about those other things that SSEs bring to the table that these indicators, or any for that matter, may not capture. But this is a step toward unified measurement. There are those remaining issues with small SSEs and their real impact that maybe we cannot measure and shouldn't, but also the economic viability, autonomy, and networks. And I've heard in this conference already quite a bit about social finance and support for SSEs, and that is, I think, a very important element of development of SSEs, so they do not need to rely on impact investment and these kinds of measures that are not fit for them. But I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It was very much impressive presentation about the outlook and structure of the STPI indicators. I'd like to add one more thing. I mean, Sonia talked about tier 3 indicators, 33 tier 3 indicators, but there are additional indicators which can be provided by the SSE OEs themselves. Margie mentioned that we cannot impose any indicators on SSE OEs. So if you cannot find any relevant indicator corresponding to a certain area, like gender or labor rights or living wage, SSE OEs can come up with their own self-made or self-created indicator instead of our indicator. So, I mean, in that case, obviously, we will lose comparability, but again, we can see the landscape or the kind of performance level of those SSE OEs with that indicator too. So currently we have 33 tier 1 indicators, 19 indicators for tier 2, and 33 tier 3 indicators, but it is more than 85 indicators because SSE OEs, social and solidarity economy organizations and enterprises can come up with their own indicators if they cannot find appropriate indicators in tier 3. Karl Marx once said his philosophy is different from Hegel's. Hegel's philosophy is to interpret the world, and his philosophy is to change the world. When we started this project, we wanted to make indicators to change the world. That is why we have a concern about the question like whether our norms are ambitious enough or not. We are trying to push all those economic entities to change their behaviors, change their patterns of production and exchange. So now I will open the floor. If you have any questions or comments on all those presentations, you can raise your hand and I will notify the people who want to intervene. So maybe Samuel, help me to identify people with questions and comments. You can raise your hand if you have questions and comments.
You can type in the chat box or just...
Yes, you can type in the chat box. So there's a question from Nazik. Nazik, could you intervene?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Sonia, for your interesting presentation.
Nazik, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, sure. I'm a researcher at KU University in Belgium, and I'm also a research advisor at the International Cooperative Alliance on SDGs. My question goes in the same direction, actually. Sonia, in her presentation, she articulated the difference between small and large SSEs, and I was just wondering whether this work takes into account the differences between developed and developing countries, as in developing countries, cooperators can have difficulties with data availability and collection, but also with generally with regulatory framework that cannot have a defining framework for SSEs.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from Marta. Marta? You can unmute your microphone first.
Hi.
Yes. Could
It
you,
was difficult.
could
I
you
am audible.
introduce yourself? Please.
Yes, my name is Marta, not Martha. Marta, no H.
Okay, Marta. Sorry. Sorry for my pronunciation.
I am so happy that I am with you today. I've been in a lot of the other processes in this process that Mexico is hosting in a sense. And I think that what we are working with is very, very important, and we got to work it even much more because we are really discerning about sustainability, which in Spanish and French there are two words, sustentabilidad y sostenibilidad. The paradigm that we have now is sostenibilidad. You know, it's not sustainable. It's being held together almost by chewing gum. And COVID has really shown us that things cannot go on as it has been. That it's more than 500 years that we've been going in the wrong direction. And, you know, one of the things that we have to really work with is with the people that are really doing these discernments, because in the global north, they are not really up to what we are really going through in the global south. And there is global south in all those countries of the north, and that's why, you know, people like say in New York are out because of the murders of Black people and Latino people. But, you know, we got to go to where things started, what happened with the original nation, the First Nations, you know. We are not perfect, but when other nations came, they forced us to sustain the so-called development that there is in those northern countries, and people are very confused because they want us to fulfill the SDGs, which are correct because this is the, you know, the UN New Development post 2015 agendas are really about correcting the injustices of the past and the present and creating a different world order. But what has happened is that even during COVID, you know, some of those billionaires are trying to become trillionaires, and the number of people that are falling in misery and, you know, poverty and impoverishment, and there are two different words in there, you know. We're not paying attention to that, and that's really hurting my knees because it hurts to see that we are not really paying attention, that we are being called to be different, not build back better. It's not about better, it's about difference, and that's what you're talking and working about. So I just want to encourage you, and part of the problem we have, you know, we are not connecting this, for example, to what happened in Bolivia. That is a very great example of what we need to watch. That's a mirror what has happened in the last 2 days, you know, just openly to the eyes of the world. So I'm not going to take much more time, but I really think that we have to do much more work on decolonization, because this is about decolonization, about the paradigm that has been imposed on peoples and nature and planet. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Marta, for your intervention. And we have one question from Aaron. Aaron, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed the presentation. And then I almost forget that I am just participating as kind of a supporter for this session. So I have one question, but is there any issues when you are developing this tier 3 indicators? Is there any indicator or the kind of issues that you wanted to cover and you wanted to include, but you actually didn't because you maybe thought that the SSEOs are not really ready to accept, or that the world is actually not really ready to kind of accept those issues? Is there any kind of indicators or areas or issues that you wanted to cover but you didn't actually?
Thank you very much for that question. Okay, so let's go back to the presenters. I mean, you can pick up questions and answer any of those questions, or if you have additional remarks, maybe you can do it.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'll go very quickly. For the first question on small and large SSEs in developing and developed countries, I made reference to that, and I apologize because I went quickly and I only made passing reference. This is critical. Even the role of the informal economy, which in many cases is where the SSE sits. The SSE is primarily the informal economy. So the work to be done is very complex, and it has to be done, with actors have to initiate this work. So then we get into the issue of data gathering, information gathering, and so on. This is a long road ahead, but I think it's one that has to be absolutely paid attention to. To our Mexican colleague, I only can say yes. And yes, and yes again. And to Arum, we didn't exclude, well, I shouldn't say we didn't exclude. We spent hours and days and weeks and months, and we debated and we discussed and we even argued. And
then debated again.
and then debated again. And Sonia and I usually agreed. But this is, it's really, it was a challenge, and primarily to, constantly, beat the issue of diversity and how, homogenization and was important. We needed standards, but we needed to take account for that diversity. But I think, as Il-chung said, in the tier 3 indicators, that we are leaving room, a lot of room, for enterprises and organizations to identify, what is important for them. Is a real, it's not a way to bow out and say, well, we throw our hands up in the air, let them take care of it. It's a way of recognizing that this is a process that has to be integrated into how we come up with our final package. Okay,
Thank you. Sonia?
No, thank you. Thanks for all the questions. I think Margie covered it. As for the difference in, SSEs not being well defined, cooperatives not being well defined, ideally, these are the indicators for any kind of enterprise. It doesn't really matter how you're incorporated or not incorporated. And it's really, so we in the pilot stage, and again, I'll defer to Sam to speak about the pilot stage. We're hoping to cover different countries, different regions, different contexts, and have that sampling to see if actually it works in reality, right? And I'm sure there'll be new learnings from that. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, on the colonization, I have one more. Yes, this issue has actually just come up, not just come up, but it's been coming up in the cooperatives, in the cooperative principles. We see these debates and hear the debates that actually principles need to be broadened by decolonization principles and the inclusion, diversity and inclusion. And so some communities, in the United States, of course, are talking about diversity and inclusion as a specific principle. And then the First Nations, obviously, I'm sure, would have a redraft of the whole thing and reconceptualization of how COPs are put together. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's, on a community-to-community basis, I would say.
Thank you very much. Peter?
Yes, no, really, just to comment on Martha's point about decolonization. This, I mean, what you've raised there is the big, the big macro issue and challenge. And I think the issue for me, it speaks of decolonization, speaks directly to, I think, to the key blind spots I was trying to point out, which is distributive injustice, North and South, and the highly skewed power relations between North and South. Now, what happened in the work we were doing when we tried to zoom in on particular sub-issues or indicators, there were a few things we flagged, but which didn't really come out which weren't worked on extensively, but I think they are things we need to continue to work on, which are related to that. So one, you mentioned under COVID, with the COVID crisis, the sort of the billionaires becoming trillionaires, quite right. But of course, the other crucial thing that's happening, which is linked to the whole thing of North-South relations, is the concentration of financial economic capital. The reinforcement of monopolies as capital takes advantage of this crisis to buy up sectors and firms and industries that are suffering. So we're going to see tremendous concentration taking place. And in the report I did with Kelly O'Neill, we say that we need indicators to look at market concentration. The other thing we flag, but don't go into in detail, but which is crucial for the North-South relationship, is not only the distribution or maldistribution of income within the enterprise, it's the maldistribution within the global value chain. So whereby the transnational corporations, the headquarters, the parts that deal with research and design, etc., capture or retail, capture the vast bulk of the value that's generated, whereas third world developing country producers often get very little. So those sorts of indicators, the distribution of value within the value chain and concentration of market share, market power, I think are two indicators linked to the whole issue of decolonization, North-South relations that I think we need to get into more.
Thank you very much, Peter. And because of time constraints, I think we have to answer all those questions raised from the audience later. I mean, after this session, maybe we can have a follow-up session on these indicators again. But we have to move on to the presentation by my colleague, Samuel Bueli-Sauer, and he's going to talk about our pilot testing of these indicators. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Il-Chong. I'm just going quickly through a couple of slides where we'll explain the pilot testing as the next big step in the SDPI project. As we've been discussing before, as has been mentioned before, testing is absolutely essential to reveal the usefulness, and as Sonia has put it, also the transformative potential of our indicator system of these three tiers of specific indicators, but also so that we can see how user-friendly the materials, the accompanying materials are, that based on which the organizations and enterprises will do their reporting. So we're talking mostly about the manual that will come out very soon, and also the reporting questionnaire for organizations and enterprises to fill in their reporting data. So we will need an extensive testing process to find out about all these different parameters. But as has also been mentioned before, the SSE is very broad. The SSE organizations vary by type, by size, sector. We've heard about north and south. That makes a big difference. We've heard about formal and informal organizations. There are different ownership and governance structures that all make a difference in terms of how organizations will perform on these indicators, but also on their ability to actually report on these indicators. So we're talking about the capacity that is there in-house to actually conduct such an assessment of a lot of, we heard 85, more or less, depending on how SSEOEs use that possibility to select own indicators in the tier 3. But so it can be a bit of a complicated process to do that, and for many organizations also the data availability will not always be given, as has already been pointed out as well. So as we go ahead with the pilot testing, we would like to, of course, take this diversity into account, but have at the same time also somewhat strike a balance on the data availability and the capacity to report, like the ability to report. So in our pilot testing that will take place over the next month until about July next year, we will have 12 for-profit enterprises and 12 SSE organizations and enterprises to test the SDPI indicators and use the manual and survey questionnaire to assess and report their sustainability performance. And as I have pointed out, because of these difficulties or the potential difficulties, we will aim to have as broad of a range of SSE organizations and enterprises as possible, but will most likely have to give priority to larger organizations and enterprises, just simply given on the ability, based on the ability to report. But I'm sure there will be an interesting discussion. The next couple of months, so you can see the timeline. In October and November, we will identify pilot testing participants, these 12 SSE organizations and enterprises. We have already started with that, but have not completed this process yet, which will be followed by a kickoff event that will most likely be held online, just as this event today, where all the participants for the different organizations will come together with the trainers of UNRISD, as well as our partner organizations R3.0. And from December 2020 to January next year, there will be an online training with several sessions and with support provided by our trainers from R3.0 to the reporting, or like at that stage, to just simply to the participating SSE organizations and enterprises. Based on that training, as well as the material that we will share already in November with these organizations, the SSE organizations and enterprises will conduct their assessment and reporting from January to about April 2021. Will share those results with us about in April and May, and we will then process those data points so that to provide and to produce a comprehensive reporting framework, or somewhat of a scorecard for these reporting organizations. Then we will go back in our research process to also incorporate, of course, those results from the pilot testing into the three-tiered systems, into specific indicators, and also so that we can still improve the accompanying materials, the manual and the questionnaire, so that we can make sure that what we are producing in terms of content, also in terms of format, is really apt to support organizations and enterprises in reporting on their sustainability. So quickly again, how it works, participating organizations and enterprises will very soon receive the list of indicators in their current state, the manual for the assessment and the questionnaire for the reporting, and then their focal points, which would be sustainability managers or whatever function within those organizations that is determined to participate in our pilot testing. These people would then receive a training, as I said, in December and January, and will also receive some accompaniment or some support in case they have questions during the preparation of the SDPI data reporting and assessment. And then again, at the end, once those data points are all submitted to us, UNRISD and R3.0 will produce those sustainability reports based on the submitted data. And yes, this is, as I said, we are still in the process of identifying SSE organizations and enterprises in the whole world to participate in this pilot testing. For SSE organizations and enterprises, this will be free of charge. So we are happy to just simply have you on board, and so that we can learn from your inputs and perspectives. And so please, if you are a representative of an SSE organization and enterprise as well that would be potentially interested in participating, or if you know of one or of a network, please reach out to Il-Chung or to me on the given email addresses that we can also share in the chat, or through any other channel that it's pretty easy to identify us. And now I will give back to Il-Chung for a last slide on other outlook or like on not only the pilot testing, but other steps that are still upcoming in this SDPI project? Please, Il-Chung.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Sam. And I'd like to add one thing to Sam's presentation. Currently, we have 9 places left. 3 organizations volunteered to have a test already from Scotland, from the United States, from Republic of Korea. So we have 9 places left, and maybe you can apply as soon as possible to take one of the 9 places left. Okay, plans for implementation, kind of future trajectory of this project. Obviously, I mean, as Sam talked about pilot testing, we're going to do it until next July, and we're going to do revision of indicators, and we're going to do global launch, and we're going to engage with discussion on harmonization of sustainability reporting indicators within the UN system. There was a question about the relationship between our indicators and UNCTAD indicators. Within UN system, there are several agencies dealing with indicators of sustainability reporting of economic entities. And we started discussion about harmonization of those indicators within the UN system. So we will engage with this discussion by providing inputs and ideas based on this indicator research and indicator itself we developed. So this is a kind of a rough plan or the future trajectory of this project. And if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand and we will answer your questions.
I see there was already a question in the chat by Valerie. Valerie, maybe?
Valerie, yes?
Hi, thank you. Maybe I'll just read it. Yeah, before break, I asked how the 2 framework, the one from UNCTAD and your framework was aligning, and I'm really pleased to see that they're aligned. FAO is currently developing a supplement to the UNCTAD framework to better measure the impact of the food and agriculture sector to the SDGs. We feel that there's a lot of indicator missing for our sector, especially on the environmental side, but also on the social side when we think about child labor and so on. So we are currently developing this. We are ready also for external review and pilot testing. And my question was, when you did this, so we are talking about tier 1 indicator as per Sonia definition. And during your research work, since you're aligning to UNCTAD, have you identified any gap at the tier 1 level that you would have liked to see in the UNCTAD list of indicator that you think that should be added?
I think I better answer this question because the inclusion or harmonization with UNCTAD indicators was mine, and I think obviously UNCTAD indicator system is about the kind of general indicators which can be applied to all different types of companies in different sectors. So there must be some indicators left out because those indicators are very much sector specific, like agriculture or service or finance. So I think what we can learn from UNCTAD indicator is methodology, first of all, and then methodology can be applied to sector indicators, which can be applied to agriculture. And our indicators are also based on same kind of approach. Our indicators should be developed into a kind of sectoral level with the much more kind of tailor-made indicators for specific industrial characteristics. But I think again, our kind of messages or emphasis like blind spots and context-based sustainability should be the kind of main principles underpinning all those different sectoral indicators. So I think, and another point related to within UN system, the indicator systems within UN system would be kind of harmonization. I mean, next task is how to harmonize all those different indicator systems developed by different agencies into one. I mean, the one coherent set of indicators or one coherent set of methodologies. I think that is one of the major tasks we have to make an effort to achieve. Sonia, you have something to add?
I wanted to comment that in the pilot, I think some collaboration and cross-referencing in the pilots make sense to me, because if FAO has already, if you're ready to pilot, we have some agricultural cooperatives in the mix in the pilot of UNRISD. So it would make perfect sense to expand the indicator testing with what FAO has done, because those guys are going to be the most probably the best place to give you comments that might be useful for the sector. If they do all of them.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't impose a lot of work burden or study burden on cooperatives, I think that's a good idea. And I think that is the future.
They do it already.
Yeah, that is the future plan. I mean, as Sonia mentioned, we have a JET from Cabot, one of the biggest cooperatives in the United States, and they are going to have a test. And again, when you had a discussion with Cabot, I mean, they are under the pressure of different tasks related to reporting and all that. So I think they need a lot of support from public agencies and international agencies like FAO or UNRISD. So as long as we can provide strong support for them to do that kind of test, I think it is a very good idea. Any other comments? Jed, do you have anything to say or add? Okay, Peter?
Yes, just no, and on Valerie's point, I guess the short answer is whether the perceived gaps related to tier 1, we've added to tier 3. So if you look at the tier 3 indicators, then that's what we sort of consider to be certain gaps. But I'm really pleased to hear that FAO is getting into this, because I can, just off the top of my head, there are a whole bunch of issues which related to agriculture, which I think are key and which they're probably not either in tier 1 or tier 3. So I'm thinking of the point I made before about value distribution within the value chain. What of the value that's created within a value chain, how much is going to small producers, particularly in developing countries? We've got issues around pricing and fair trade. That would be really interesting to sort of capture aspects of fair trade. And the other relates to the empowerment of small producers, small farmers, etc. So those sorts of things if we could think about indicators related to those sorts of issues, I think that would complement very nicely what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think
Can I make one comment, please?
Yes, Margie.
Yeah, I think that in the selection of the 9 that remain, and we have proposals, yes, it has to be a larger organization with capacity, but we will do our best to make sure that there is at least one social and solidarity economy that is a nonprofit enterprise, given that they represent such a huge proportion of the social and solidarity economy globally.
Thank you very much. Jed sent me a message like, I hope you won't be too disappointed that we are not a very large as daily cooperatives in the US, but large in terms of ambition and contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, thank you very much, all the participants, including audience and presenters. And I'd like to thank especially staffs of GSEF, Lawrence Kwok, Martin Hong, Armin Kim. And we have a special guest from UNCTAD, Yuki Mitsuka. I mean, she didn't have a chance to talk about, but I think we will have another opportunity to have much deeper and extensive discussions on these indicators. Thank you very much for a long time, participation of all the audience, and we will keep in touch by email. And if you are interested in participating in pilot testing, please contact us and we will discuss together. Thank you very much. Have a good night, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Bye-bye.